When a struggling rancher in 1869 Wyoming took in 2 starving orphan girls, he never imagined that one possessed a mechanical genius that would attract dangerous men from across the territory. 14 years later, a mysterious golden stagecoach arrived at his ranch, carrying secrets that would either destroy his makeshift family or transform their lives forever. But which visitor from the past was truly behind the wheel? Thunder rolled across the empty Wyoming plains like a giant's angry voice. Josiah Crawford pressed his back against the wooden fence post, watching dark clouds swallow the sun whole. His ranch looked like a graveyard of broken dreams, dead cattle scattered across brown grass, a leaning barn that creaked with every gust of wind, and a house that hadn't heard laughter in 5 long years. The year 1869 had been cruel to everyone in the territory, but it seemed to hate Josiah most of all. His wife and son had died when he was away selling horses in Denver. The drought killed his crops. Now the bank wanted his land, and he had 30 days to find money he didn't have. He pulled the crumpled letter from his pocket and read it again. Final notice. It said in bold black letters that looked like tiny coffins. 42 years old, and he felt like an ancient tree ready to fall. That's when he heard the crying. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks. But the sound came again, soft, scared, and definitely human. Josiah squinted through the dust storm and saw 2 small shapes stumbling toward his gate. They moved like ghosts, thin and wobbly, barely staying upright. "Please, mister," called a young voice. "We need help." Josiah's heart jumped in his chest. 2 girls stood at his broken gate, holding hands like they were afraid the world might tear them apart. The older one looked about 12, with tangled dark hair and eyes that had seen too much sadness. The smaller girl, maybe 8 years old, sucked her thumb and hid behind her sister's torn dress. "Name's Catherine," the older girl said, lifting her chin high, even though her voice shook. "This is Grace. Our mama and papa died of fever in Laramie town. We walked here for 3 days without food." Josiah stared at them, feeling something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking on a frozen pond. These girls looked exactly like he felt, lost, hungry, and forgotten by the world. He should turn them away. He could barely feed himself, let alone 2 extra mouths. The smart thing would be to point them toward Cheyenne, where the territorial orphanage would take them in. But looking at Catherine's brave face and Grace's frightened eyes, Josiah couldn't make his mouth say those words. Instead, he heard himself speaking like someone else was controlling his voice. "Well, I reckon I could use some help around this old place." Catherine's suspicious look melted away for just a second, showing the scared little girl hiding underneath. "You really mean it, mister? Name's Josiah Crawford. And yes, I mean every word." As he led them toward his empty house, a cold feeling crawled up his spine like a spider. Something about this moment felt bigger than just helping 2 hungry children. Like he was starting something that would change everything forever. But what exactly was he getting himself into? 3 weeks later, the Crawford ranch buzzed with life, like a beehive in springtime. Catherine had magic hands with the horses, even Old Thunder, the meanest stallion Josiah owned, would eat sugar cubes right from her palm. Grace turned out to be a wizard with a needle and thread, fixing torn clothes so perfectly you couldn't tell they'd ever been ripped. But the biggest change was the sound of laughter floating through the house again. "Josiah, look what I made!" Grace called out, running across the yard with something clutched in her small hands. She'd sewn a tiny horse from scraps of fabric, complete with a miniature saddle and bridle that looked like the real thing. "That's mighty fine work, little one," Josiah said, kneeling down to examine the toy. His heart felt warm in a way it hadn't since before the fever took his family. Maybe taking in these girls wasn't such a crazy idea after all. That night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Josiah noticed a golden glow coming from the barn. Curious, he crept across the yard and peeked through a gap in the wooden boards. What he saw inside made his jaw drop like a rock falling down a well. Catherine sat cross-legged in the hay, surrounded by tiny metal pieces that sparkled in the lamplight. In her hands, she held a broken pocket watch, but she was doing something impossible with it. Her fingers moved like a surgeon's, adjusting springs and gears with tools that looked too big for her small hands. As Josiah watched in amazement, the watch began to tick with perfect rhythm. "How in tarnation did you learn to do that?" he whispered, stepping into the barn. Catherine's hands froze, like she'd been caught stealing cookies. Fear flashed across her face, the same terror he'd seen that first day at the gate. "My papa taught me," she said quietly. "Before the sickness got him. He said I had special fingers for fixing things." Josiah knelt down beside her, studying the intricate gears and springs. The work was better than anything he'd seen from trained watchmakers in Denver. "This is incredible, Catherine. You've got a real gift. Please don't tell nobody," she begged, her green eyes wide with worry. "Folks get strange ideas about girls doing man's work. They think it ain't right or natural." In that moment, Josiah saw himself reflected in her words. He knew exactly what it felt like when people decided you weren't good enough, weren't worth their time or respect. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your secret's safe with me, child. But Catherine, this talent of yours, it's going to be important someday." What neither of them saw was the dark shadow that pulled away from the barn wall, or the glint of metal that caught the moonlight as their hidden watcher melted back into the night. Someone had been spying on them, and now they knew Catherine's secret too. Catherine's fingers moved like magic across the broken pocket watch, each tiny piece finding its perfect home. 3 weeks had passed since that first hungry night, and the Crawford ranch buzzed with new energy. Grace hummed while hanging laundry, her small hands surprisingly strong from farm work. But it was Catherine's secret talent that would change everything. "Where on earth did you learn such skill?" Josiah whispered, discovering her midnight workshop in the barn during the cool October of 1869. The golden lamplight revealed an impossible sight. Scattered across hay bales lay dozens of mechanical wonders, clocks that chimed perfect melodies, music boxes with dancing figures, and gadgets Josiah couldn't even name. Catherine's green eyes sparkled with pride and fear as she carefully adjusted a delicate spring. "Papa taught me before the sickness took him," she said softly. "He was the finest watchmaker in all of Laramie. Said I had hands blessed by angels." Josiah knelt beside the remarkable child, watching her restore life to broken timepieces with movements smoother than silk. Each gear clicked into place with satisfying precision. The air smelled of metal polish and hope. "My papa said something else too," Catherine continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "He said folks get mighty strange ideas about girls who can do man's work. They think it ain't natural like." The weight of those words settled heavy on Josiah's shoulders. He understood the crushing burden of being different, of carrying gifts that others couldn't accept. His own dreams had been crushed by people who thought a poor rancher couldn't amount to much. "Your secret stays safe with me, little one," he promised. "But Catherine, this gift of yours, it's going to open doors you never dreamed possible." Neither noticed the shadow creeping away from the barn wall, or heard the soft footsteps disappearing into darkness. Someone else now knew about Catherine's extraordinary abilities, and word travels fast across the empty plains. Days turned to weeks as Catherine's confidence grew. She fixed every broken thing on the ranch, from squeaky gate hinges to Josiah's father's old hunting rifle. Grace discovered her own talents too, mending clothes with stitches so tiny and perfect they seemed painted on. But late at night, when prairie winds howled across the grassland, Catherine would press her ear to her pillow and listen for approaching hoofbeats. Something deep in her heart whispered that their peaceful days were numbered. The same instincts that had kept her and Grace alive on the dangerous streets now screamed warnings she couldn't ignore. "Grace," she whispered one moonless evening, "promise me something. If bad men come for us, you run to the old oak tree behind the well. Hide there till I come fetch you." Grace's sleepy voice drifted through the darkness. "What bad men, Catherine? Just promise me." "I promise." But Catherine knew promises meant little when wolves came hunting for lambs. And somewhere in the distance, those wolves were already sharpening their teeth. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon as October winds brought more than just changing weather to the Crawford Ranch. The first threat arrived in a fancy black carriage that looked completely out of place on the dusty Wyoming trails. Ezra Holcomb stepped down from his expensive ride, like a spider emerging from its web. His dark suit was perfectly pressed despite the long journey from Cheyenne, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a man who viewed everything as property to be bought or sold. "Crawford," he called out, consulting a gold pocket watch with theatrical precision. "I trust you've been considering our previous discussions about your outstanding debts." Josiah emerged from the barn, Catherine and Grace flanking him like loyal soldiers ready for battle. The morning air crackled with tension as the two men faced each other across the dusty yard. "I've got until December to settle up, Holcomb," Josiah replied, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "That was our agreement, signed and witnessed." Holcomb's laugh sounded like breaking glass scattered across stone. "Ah, but circumstances have a way of changing, don't they? The bank has decided to accelerate the timeline. You now have exactly 30 days. Grace pressed closer to Josiah's protective bulk, while Catherine stepped forward with blazing eyes. Her small fists clenched at her sides as righteous anger burned in her chest. "This here's Mr. Crawford's land, Mr. Fancy Pants," she declared with fierce courage. "You got no right coming here making threats." "Catherine," Josiah warned gently, though pride swelled in his heart at her bravery. Holcomb's cold gaze shifted to the girls with disturbing interest, like a hawk studying mice in an open field. How delightfully naive. "Tell me, Crawford, have you properly registered these children with territorial authorities?" The orphanage officials would find their current situation most irregular. The threat hung in the autumn air like smoke from distant fires. Josiah felt his world tilting dangerously. The fragile happiness they'd built together suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. After Holcomb departed in his sinister carriage, Catherine found Josiah sitting on the porch steps, his weathered face buried in calloused hands. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden, but shadows gathered in the corners of their vision. "We could disappear," Catherine whispered, settling beside him. "Grace and me, we know how to vanish when danger comes calling." Josiah looked up at her, seeing not a frightened child, but a fellow warrior who understood the weight of impossible choices. "No running, little one. We stand our ground and fight." But deep in his bones, he felt the approaching storm. The shadow that had witnessed Catherine's mechanical genius weeks ago had done more than spy emotion. It had set wheels in motion that might crush everything they held dear. That night, as Wyoming winds howled across endless grassland, none of them noticed the lone rider watching from the distant ridge. The mysterious figure sat motionless for hours before finally turning away, carrying news that would soon bring far more dangerous visitors to their door. Time was running out faster than sand through an hourglass, and their enemies were closing in. Thunder rolled across the morning sky as 7 horses charged toward the Crawford Ranch. Sheriff Morton Briggs led the group, his silver badge catching the early light like a warning signal. Behind him rode the smooth-talking bankman, Holcomb, whose black suit made him look like a crow among the dusty riders. But the third man made Josiah's blood turn cold. Professor Aldrich Pemberton sat tall in his saddle, wearing clothes finer than anything seen in Wyoming territory. His gray hair was slicked back perfectly, and his pale eyes studied the ranch like a snake watching mice. When he smiled, it didn't reach those cold eyes. "Josiah Crawford," Sheriff Briggs called out, his voice booming across the yard. "You're keeping children who ain't properly signed up with the territory law. Hand them over, and we'll talk about your money troubles." Josiah stepped onto his porch, feeling Catherine and Grace press close behind him. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. "These girls are family now. You got no right to take them." Professor Pemberton urged his fancy horse forward, speaking in a voice smooth as honey but twice as dangerous. "Mr. Crawford, surely you want what's best for the children." I represent the California Institute of Advanced Learning. Young Catherine would receive the finest education money can buy. Catherine grabbed Josiah's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. How does he know my name? She whispered. But Josiah already knew the terrible answer. Someone had been watching them. Someone had seen Catherine's secret work in the barn. The child has remarkable gifts, Pemberton continued, his smile growing wider. Gifts that shouldn't be wasted on this primitive existence. In San Francisco, she could work with the greatest minds of our time. I ain't leavin', Catherine declared, stepping out from behind Josiah. Her young voice shook, but her chin lifted with fierce pride. This is my home. Pemberton's mask slipped for just a moment, showing something ugly underneath. My dear girl, you misunderstand the situation entirely. The morning air grew thick with tension as the mounted men spread out, surrounding the small family. Grace whimpered and buried her face in Josiah's shirt. Catherine's hands clenched into fists at her sides. You see, Pemberton said, pulling out a rolled paper from his coat, I have here a contract with certain investors back east. They're very interested in mechanical innovations, particularly those created by young, trainable minds. The horrible truth hit Josiah like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about education. This was about stealing Catherine's brilliant mind and using it to make other people rich. Sheriff Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Now, Professor, you said this was all legal-like. Oh, it is, Pemberton assured him. The children are unregistered, which makes them wards of whoever can provide proper care. I have excellent references. Josiah's rifle leaned against the porch rail, just 3 steps away. But 7 armed men surrounded his property, and one wrong move would put Catherine and Grace in terrible danger. Then Catherine did something that surprised everyone. She laughed. You want to see what I can build? She called out, her voice carrying across the yard with new confidence. You think you know what I'm capable of? Before anyone could stop her, she sprinted toward the barn, Grace running right behind her. Stop them! Pemberton shouted. But Catherine had already disappeared inside. That's when the ground began to shake, with a sound none of them had ever heard before. A roar like angry thunder erupted from the barn as the huge doors burst open with a crash that echoed across the prairie. What rolled out defied every law of nature the men thought they knew. Catherine sat at the controls of a machine that gleamed like captured sunlight. The old farm wagon had been transformed into something magical. Brass gears the size of dinner plates spun in perfect harmony. Steam hissed from carefully placed pipes, and the whole creation moved with the smooth power of a giant clock. Grace perched beside her sister, eyes wide with excitement instead of fear. Sweet mother of pearl, Sheriff Briggs breathed, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. The mechanical wagon rolled forward with unstoppable purpose, its golden fittings catching the morning light and throwing it back in dazzling patterns. Professor Pemberton's men scattered like startled birds as their horses reared and snorted in terror at the impossible sight. Catherine's voice rang out clear and strong above the mechanical symphony. This is what happens when you leave me alone with broken things and time to think. But her triumph lasted only seconds. A sharp crack split the air, and Josiah stumbled backward, red spreading across his chest like spilled paint. Grace screamed, a sound that cut through every heart present. Catherine's amazing machine ground to a halt as she leaped down to catch Josiah before he fell. Papa Josiah! Grace cried, the word Papa spilling out for the very first time. Nobody could say who fired the shot. In the chaos of rearing horses and shouting men, the bullet had come from somewhere in Pemberton's group. Sheriff Briggs dismounted quickly, his face grave as stone. That's enough, he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of law. Everyone lower your weapons right now. Josiah's eyes fluttered as Catherine cradled his head in her small hands. Stay with us, she whispered desperately. Please don't leave us alone. But Professor Pemberton wasn't finished with his cruel game. Unfortunate, he said coldly, not even bothering to dismount. But the children still need proper guardians. Mr. Crawford clearly cannot provide adequate protection. Catherine looked up at him with eyes blazing like green fire. You did this. You brought guns to our home. I brought opportunity, Pemberton replied smoothly, which you've just demonstrated you're ready for. That remarkable machine proves you need resources I can provide. Sheriff Briggs knelt beside Josiah, checking his pulse with experienced hands. He's alive, but he needs a doctor fast. The nearest doctor is in Cheyenne, Holcomb pointed out, with false concern. 3 hours by fast horse, unless, of course, the professor's private physician happened to be traveling with his party. The trap was perfectly laid. Accept Pemberton's help and owe him everything, or watch Josiah bleed to death on his own land. Catherine's mind raced through possibilities, like her mechanical gears spinning. There had to be another way. There was always another way if you were smart enough to find it. Then the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced a new player in their deadly game. A stagecoach appeared on the horizon, moving faster than any normal conveyance should travel. But this wasn't any ordinary coach. Even from a distance, it gleamed like solid gold in the morning Sunday. Professor Pemberton's face went white as fresh snow. No, he whispered. She couldn't have found me here. The golden coach drew closer, pulled by 6 magnificent horses, whose brass harnesses sang like bells in the wind. The driver, a distinguished gentleman in a fine coat, brought the impossible vehicle to a halt directly between Pemberton and the wounded family. From inside the coach stepped a woman who commanded attention without saying a word. Her silver hair caught the light, and her winter blue eyes held the kind of authority that came from years of making important decisions. When she spoke, her voice carried the refined sound of Eastern education, but underneath lay steel as strong as any Wyoming rancher's. "Hello, Aldrich," she said with deadly calm. "We need to talk." The golden stagecoach rolled up the dusty hill like something from a fairy tale, its shiny paint catching sunlight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. Catherine pressed her hands to her wounded chest, watching this impossible sight, while Josiah lay bleeding in the dirt beside her. The fancy coach had 6 white horses, each one prettier than anything she'd ever seen, and brass fittings that jingled like church bells in the morning air. A woman stepped down from the coach, moving with the grace of someone who'd never known hunger or fear. Her silver hair was pulled back neat, and her traveling dress cost more than most folks saw in a year. But her eyes, those winter blue eyes, held something Catherine recognized. Pain. Loss. The kind that changed you forever. "Professor Pemberton," the woman said, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife through butter. "How lucky I am to find you here." Pemberton's face went white as fresh snow. His hands started shaking, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked scared. "Margaret, you're supposed to be in San Francisco." "Plans change, Aldrich." The woman walked past the armed men like they were nothing more than fence posts. She knelt beside Catherine and Josiah, her fancy dress getting dirty without a care. "These children need help, not your empty promises." Grace peeked out from behind the mechanical wagon, her thumb in her mouth. "Who are you, lady?" "My name is Margaret Ashworth, sweetheart, and I've been looking for your sister for a very long time." She touched Catherine's shoulder gently. "Your father was the finest watchmaker in all of California. He wrote to me before he died, telling me about his daughter who could fix anything with gears and springs." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "You knew my pa? He was my dear friend. When the fever took your family, I hired Professor Pemberton to find you and bring you somewhere safe." Margaret's voice turned cold as winter wind. "Instead, he told me you died with your parents." Pemberton backed toward his horse, but Sheriff Briggs blocked his path. The sheriff's face was grim as a thundercloud. "Seems like there's more to this story than bank debts." "Much more," Margaret agreed. She pulled a thick envelope from her coat. "I have letters here, dozens of them from young people across the West. All promising inventors, all supposedly dead, according to Professor Pemberton's reports, all actually working in secret factories, creating wonders while he takes the credit and the money. The truth hit Catherine like a punch to the stomach. Pemberton hadn't just wanted to take her away, he'd wanted to steal her inventions, just like he'd done to others. "The children stay here," Margaret announced, standing tall. "This ranch will become something special, a place where young minds can grow and create, protected by people who truly care about them." Josiah stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Catherine? Grace? We're here, Papa Josiah," Grace whispered, using the name that felt more natural than breathing. But Pemberton wasn't finished yet. With a desperate snarl, he reached for his gun one final time. 10 months later, in the spring of 1871, Catherine stood in her brand-new workshop, surrounded by tools that sparkled like jewels in the morning light. Steam engines hummed quietly in the corner, and gears of every size hung from wooden pegs along the walls. Through the wide windows, she could see Grace teaching 3 younger children how to weave patterns with golden thread. The ranch had changed completely. Where old broken fences once sagged, neat white buildings now housed workshops, classrooms, and living spaces for 12 young inventors who'd come from all across the territory. Margaret had kept her promise. This had become a place where children with special gifts could learn and grow without fear. "Catherine!" Grace called from the garden. "Come see what Tommy built." Catherine smiled, wiping grease from her hands with a clean rag. Tommy was only 9, but he had a gift for making things that moved. Yesterday, he'd shown her a wooden bird that could actually fly for short distances. She found Grace and the others gathered around a small table, where Tommy had built something amazing. It looked like a tiny town, complete with little houses, roads, and even a miniature stagecoach. But when Tommy turned a handle on the side, everything came to life. The coach moved along the roads, tiny people walked between buildings, and smoke actually came out of the little chimneys. "It's wonderful," Catherine said, meaning every word. "How did you make the smoke?" Tommy grinned, his front teeth missing. "Miss Margaret showed me how to use tiny pipes and steam, just like your big engines, but smaller." Margaret appeared beside them, carrying a letter with official-looking seals. "Speaking of engines, Catherine, I have news from the railroad company. They want to order 50 of your automatic switching devices." Catherine's heart jumped with excitement. Her switches could change train tracks without any people having to stand in dangerous places. The railroad men said her invention would save lives and make trains run better. 50? She gasped. "That's more than I've ever made." "Which brings me to another piece of news," Margaret continued, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "The territorial governor wants to visit next month. He's heard about our school and wants to see what young minds can accomplish when given proper support." From the porch of the main house, Josiah watched his daughters with pride swelling in his chest like warm bread rising. The doctor said his wounded shoulder would always be a little stiff, but he didn't mind. Small price to pay for the miracle that had transformed their lives. The golden stagecoach sat in the main barn now, converted into Catherine's favorite workspace. She'd added wheels that could move it anywhere on the ranch, and sometimes she used it to carry her inventions to the testing grounds behind the workshops. Professor Pemberton was in prison now, thanks to Sheriff Briggs and Margaret's evidence. 12 young people had been freed from his secret factories, and 6 of them had chosen to come live and learn at the Crawford Ranch School for Young Inventors. "Papa Josiah," Grace said, running up to hug his waist. "Catherine says she's going to build a machine that can wash all our clothes at once. Is that possible?" Josiah chuckled, remembering when he thought his life was over. "With your sister, anything's possible, little one." As the sun set over Wyoming territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the sounds of laughter and learning filled the evening air. The Crawford family had discovered something more valuable than any treasure they'd learned, that home isn't a place you find, but a feeling you create with the people you choose to love.